this evening to enjoy our program Family Dynamics with MS that we do in collaboration with the Mercy MS Clinic. This is a very special collaboration. We're doing patient education programs about once a quarter. Out of curiosity, how many people here are not members of the MS Society? There's just one or two. Okay. You feel like a member. I've seen you so many times. You know, the great thing about these kind of collaborations is it gives folks an opportunity to learn a little bit more about this local resource, which our chapter is right in your backyard. If you don't know, and you haven't visited our website in a while, I encourage you to do so. Find out a little bit more about a lot of our programs and services that deal with wellness, not only symptom management, but also social programs, and you can get more information about direct financial assistance, advocacy. There's quite a variety of ways that we're trying to meet our members' needs. And your point of view is very important. This program was brought to you in part by feedback that was given at a town hall meeting last April. People said, we feel like we need to know more about how to deal with issues with MS within the family. And Dr. Kalb so graciously agreed to come down from New York as a foremost expert on this topic and share her expertise with us. So thank you very much for your feedback. You have an evaluation tonight. If you have other ideas or things that you would like to share, like you would like to see, please let us know. We're going to be doing a family program every quarter, whether it's a family-generated social, or perhaps even a family retreat towards the end of the year. So if you aren't getting our MS Connection, and look out for the new MS Connection, because the insert has different programs, follow us along throughout this year. You're going to see some very exciting programming. And again, your donations at every footstep on those walks is bringing you local programs and services. So if you have walked, thank you. If you've donated, thank you. We appreciate and welcome your ongoing support. And I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Schaefer so he can give you a little bit more background about tonight's speaker, Dr. Kalb.
Thank you, Ann. And I'm glad you could all come this evening. And as Ann said, this is actually our 6th in our ongoing lecture series. We've had quarterly lectures about various topics in MS. I've been doing MS for quite a few years, and I realized long ago that after I spend the initial visit and even the follow-up visits with a patient, there's so much more to know that I can't deliver or I can't take care of in that short time that we're together. So that's why I've always referred people to the National MS Society, where there's a lot more resources available. And for the last couple of years now, since we've been the Mercy MS Center, it's been great to be able to do programs like this in collaboration, because many issues that really require a lot more explanation and a lot more time. And one of those issues is communication and family dynamics in families with someone with MS. And it's always struck me that MS is one of the hardest things to live with or to deal with, in the sense that there's a lot of it that's invisible, but you look so good. And so how does your partner, or how do the other people in your family know how to tell what kind of a day you're having, whether it's a good day or a bad day? Also, it's a lifelong thing. It's not like, you know, other diseases that we take care of in neurology, where things are, you know, have a pretty prescribed course, and you know where things are going to go. So I think this is a really important issue. So our speaker this evening, Dr. Kalb, is maybe known to a number of you. She's been involved in MS education, not only through the MS Society, but the Jimmy Huger, the Can Do program. How many of you know about the Jimmy Huger program, Can Do? I see some people here, actually quite a few, who have been part of it, so you probably know Roz from those sessions. She's also author of a number of books, including my favorite, MS for Dummies. It's been out for a couple of years, but when I've tried to pick out things for our website and for our materials, I found no better book than this. And actually, one of the other authors is Barbara Geiser, who's in the center up here on the picture. Barbara is a neurologist at UCLA and also very involved in MS care.
And we trained together 30 years ago, Barbara and I.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
with Labe.
Sure it was 30 years ago. Couldn't be. That's impossible.
30 years ago.
Nobody believes that. So Roz is currently the Vice President for Professional Resources for the National MS Society, which means she oversees the development of lots of material that goes to physicians and the patient materials as well. And
No, our center just supports clinicians who are taking care of people with MS. All those publications you read actually come out of a whole different department at the society. I just get to help update them periodically.
so Roz has had her fingers in a lot of pies. Anne mentioned that she came all the way from New York, but actually she came all the way from Amsterdam, where we've been at the ECTRIMS meeting. ECTRIMS, the European Consortium of Research and Treatment of Multiple Sclerosis, which is the largest MS meeting in the world. Over 7,000 physicians from 95 countries are there, with the latest of information. This picture was actually taken there. Roz on the left, Barbara in the middle, and Jose Cabrera, who's a neurologist in Cuba, who comes to these programs regularly. So we really deeply appreciate Roz coming all this way, and then she's getting taken to the airport at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning to go to Vail for the next UCA program. So Roz, you can take it from there. And
I'll stay awake as long as I can. I'm not sure what day it is, but I'll stay awake as long as I can. So you just need to put up the other
I'll
slides.
stand behind you to make sure you're right.
Well, I am very excited to be here. I wish I hadn't had to come by way of Amsterdam. But we've been talking about my coming for a while now, so I'm glad and honored to be here to talk about a topic that has really been central to my career in MS, to talk about the family. So you have a job. I don't know your name, but you have a job because I'm not supposed to wander over here in front of the screen. So anytime you see me wandering over in front of the screen, go like this so that I'll know that I have to go back this way, okay?
Is your microphone working?
Is my microphone working?
Yes.
Can you hear me in the back?
Can everybody hear? Okay.
Okay, so these are the topics that I'm going to try to cover tonight. That's a lot. We'll take a little break in the middle so that you can stretch. But they gave me a really tough topic, which was family dynamics. And as I thought about everything that goes into family dynamics, it just covered a lot of territory. So I really want to talk about some of the most common challenges that I've heard about from people just like you who are living with MS. I want to figure out how we can manage that emotional roller coaster that so many people with MS experience. Give you some tips on actual coping strategies to help make it easier. Particularly one I like a lot, talk, so that your partner will listen, and listen so your partner will talk. That's actually a takeoff on a book that I read when my kids were little, which was by somebody who was telling you to talk so that your children would listen, and listen so your children would talk. How to develop care partnerships, really balanced relationships that work for all of you, and how to talk to kids about MS. So when I thought about the title, Family Dynamics, what that brought to mind was movement and keeping moving in your lives in spite of MS. And every family has a rhythm. We don't think about it, but each family over time develops its own rhythm, and we take it for granted until something comes along that disrupts that day-to-day routine, the rhythms of everyday life that each family develops. It's unique. So a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight is the ways in which MS can disrupt that rhythm and strategies that you can use to try to get yourselves back in a comfortable rhythm in spite of MS. So I've always talked about MS as being like an uninvited guest. You know, somebody who shows up at your house with all their junk, spreads it all over the house, and doesn't go home. It's a little bit like having your kids come home from college, but they don't leave, right? So everybody in the family has to form a relationship with this guest. And each relationship is going to be unique. When that stranger moves in, there are a lot of common stresses associated with that. And remember, I've really been working in MS since 1979. And all of what you're going to hear, I've actually learned from individuals and families like you. I started to work at the MS Center at Albert Einstein in New York because I needed a job. I had a toddler, I'd finished graduate school, I loved the idea of doing groups, and I wanted a job. And I took a job at this MS Center. I knew nothing about MS. I'd never known anybody with MS. I didn't know what it was. And I got hooked. I got hooked because I got to know people like you who taught me a lot about how to live with a challenge that just comes out of nowhere and turns life topsy-turvy. So these are the stresses that people have told me about. First of all, it's chronic, right? Doesn't go away. If you're diagnosed in your teens or 20s or 30s, as most people are, you're living with MS for decades. It's certainly unpredictable. I think of all the words that people use to describe MS when they're talking about it, it's that it's so unpredictable and uncertain. Nobody knows how they're going to feel from morning till night, let alone next week or a month from now or a couple years down the road. So you're always having to adjust and adapt because the disease keeps changing. It's expensive. And in addition to those challenges for individuals, MS challenges families because it involves a lot of changes and losses. And we're going to talk a lot tonight about some of those losses and the grieving that goes along with it. And the last stress is actually a new one. When I started in MS a few years ago, there were no choices to make. Basically, we were kind of told to go home and learn to live with it because there wasn't much to do. And today we have lots of choices in terms of treatment, in terms of lifestyle, having kids. So we'll talk all about those things. Okay, so MS is a chronic disease. We know that life expectancy is minimally affected in MS. Most people can expect to live very close to a full lifespan. And today, even though we've come a huge distance since 1979, we still have no cure and no real predictable means of slowing disease progression, although John and I actually heard about some things coming along in the near future that may really have an impact on disease progression. Certainly is unpredictable, as we've talked about, and John mentioned, symptoms being invisible, and so many of them are. In fact, if you look at a full list of all the symptoms that MS can produce, there are only a couple of them that people can actually see. So one of the issues that challenges families all the time is that somebody they love is affected by numerous symptoms that they can't actually see. MS can really change lots of things. And so anybody who's diagnosed with this may find that the disease affects their physical functions, cognitive functions, the way they think and remember things. We know it can affect emotions, and we'll talk more about that tonight. All those changes can mean that your roles change. Your ability to do things at home or at work the way you used to do them can be affected. And these changes alter the way people see themselves and sometimes alter the way others see them. And it affects the ways people interact with each other, right? And certainly when you have an unpredictable disease that can change things along the way, it can kind of interfere with those plans and dreams. So in other words, it can really shake the foundations, right? I've had people describe it as feeling like there's this perpetual earthquake going on under their feet. Things never quite feel firm anymore because the disease is changing so much. It's also expensive, I don't need to tell you, and it's not just the medications, which we all know are so expensive, but it's loss of employment for many people. But it also is these intangible costs. It's not just dollars and cents. It takes so much more time to do everything. And what's one of our most precious resources in this busy world of ours? Time. And how frustrating it is when things take you so much longer to do than you used to do them. Energy. How many people here are fatigued? It's very, very common. And yet with MS, everything takes more energy, more time. Those are valuable resources. So one of the challenges for families that we'll talk about is how MS can lead to an imbalance in how those precious resources are used in the family, because sometimes MS can be greedy. It can want to take all the time and all the emotional energy and all the money. But for a family to be healthy and intact and functional, all those resources, whether it's money, time, energy, emotions, have to be equally spread among all the family members so that everybody's needs get met. So the family has to work together to make sure that the MS doesn't take more of those resources than we want it to. Now, I mentioned before about complex choices that people have now that they didn't have. And truly, when I started in it, my mentor, Leib Scheinberg, who was one of the early greats in MS care and started arguably one of the first comprehensive care centers in the country for MS. And he referred to the old days as the diagnose and adios school of MS care. Hi, I'm Dr. So-and-so, glad to meet you. Sorry you have MS, there's nothing I can do, you'll just have to go home and learn to live with it. And today, we've got lots and lots of treatment options and more on the way. In the old days, people were told to just go home and rest. Quit your job, don't stress yourself out. In other words, it's time to make a career out of MS because you can't do anything else. But now we know that people can and should live lives that are as full and active as they want them to be. And we put a lot of effort into helping people maintain employment, learn how to get the job accommodations they need, and stay active in whatever ways they want to and are able. Okay? And before 1950, men and women with MS were told never to think about having kids. Might not be good for the kids. They wouldn't be good parents. It might make MS worse for the women. No kids. Not anymore. Now the choice is yours. So the interesting thing about having all these choices is that when I started working in MS, people would come in and talk to me about how they felt all their choices had been stolen from them. And they were stressed out because they felt trapped and limited and without options. And now what they come in and talk to me about is that they're stressed out about making the wrong choices. So it's wonderful to have more options and more choices, but it brings a different kind of stress because nobody wants to pick wrong. Nobody wants to do the wrong thing. So it's added a stress, but at least it's a positive stress because there's so many more options today than there were when I started. So how do people react to this? Well, I think initially, when families first hear that someone they love has MS, there's just a lot of shock and disbelief. This happens to other people. This can't be happening to us. just denying it. It can't be true. I'm not going to think about this. It's not real. It's not happening. Doctor must have made a mistake. This is crazy. Fear. Who wouldn't be afraid? Diagnosed with a chronic unpredictable illness can be pretty scary. And anger. Pretty normal reaction when something comes at you like a bolt out of the blue and suddenly changes everything. There are also longer term reactions, right? And grief is a big one, and we're going to actually spend some time tonight talking about grieving. But just remember that it's a natural, normal, healthy response when things change and are lost and feel out of control. So is anxiety. As adults, we don't like to feel out of control of anything. Look, you spend your whole childhood, you can't wait to grow up because you think suddenly, or finally, after all those years of waiting, you'll be in charge and you'll be in control. And sometimes for young adults, getting diagnosed with MS is the very first threat to that feeling of being invulnerable, in control, ready to take on the world. So that loss of things being in control and predictable makes people anxious. Will I get to work today? Will I get to the bathroom on time? Will I be able to take care of my kids? Am I going to be safe driving in the car? Makes us anxious when we're not sure about those things. It also makes us angry. And it's not just the person with MS here who can be feeling these things. It's everybody else in the family too. And guilt. People feel guilty when they feel like they're letting other people down, not being as loving or giving as they want to be, not being able to fix things, make it right, particularly for somebody that you love. And I think, and that those angry feelings that I talked about, we're not really good with anger in our culture. I sort of think anger's bad. So when people feel angry, it tends to make them feel guilty, particularly if that anger is towards somebody they love, or at God, or at the doctor who's taking care of them. People feel overwhelmed with anger, and then on top of that, they feel guilty about feeling angry. So let me talk about grief a little bit more. And I use this picture because I think it helps to describe what I mean. If you spend an entire lifetime putting together the picture of who you are, sort of like those picture puzzles, you can take a photograph to the store and they'll turn it into a jigsaw puzzle. You're made up of all the things that make you unique. Whatever your personality traits, your quirks, your foibles, the things that make you wonderful, the things that make you not so wonderful, they're all part of you. And you build that up over a lifetime, and then suddenly the doctor says, you have multiple sclerosis. And it's like this weird, oddly shaped puzzle piece, and you have to figure out where it's going to fit in that picture of who you are. When some people hear that news, they literally kind of go to pieces. Right? You've all known somebody who's reacted that way, just sort of overwrought, distressed, frightened, and it takes them a while to kind of pull themselves together and figure out how they're going to make their life with MS, who they're going to be now that MS has entered their lives. That's a grieving process. In order to fit that new piece of information about yourself in there, you kind of have to let go of the old picture in order to begin figuring out where the MS is going to fit. The bummer about MS is you don't just get to do it once, right? You have to keep doing it over and over again. Every time MS takes away something that's important to you or changes the way you do things, you have to regroup again. So grieving is part of life with a chronic unpredictable disease. It's gonna ebb and flow as the disease does its thing. So you may find yourself grieving periodically many times. Challenge for families is that every one of you is feeling all those feelings. But it's not like an orchestra with a conductor standing up there making sure that everything happens when it's supposed to and that all the parts of the orchestra are playing together. It's like an orchestra with no conductor. Each of you is feeling the feelings you're feeling, and it may be out of sync with the others in your family. So one of you may be feeling sad and grief-stricken, while the other one of you is dealing with all those angry feelings. Sometimes that makes it hard to talk to each other about how you're feeling. Or one of you is ready to come to educational meetings and read everything you can find and go on the internet and go to support groups and talk to other people. And your partner may be saying, hey, I don't want to think about this at all. All right, we'll deal with it when we have to. I don't want to read about it. I don't want to talk about it. So your coping styles can be very, very different, but there you are in the same family. So, when I put that slide up, I didn't actually know that it moved. A little spooky. So you mean it's not actually moving, it's just moving. Very good. Thank you. So what that adds up to is just this constant flow of emotions in your household, right? So it can feel like walking on eggshells. Everybody's kind of tiptoeing around because there's a lot of feelings floating around, but nobody can quite get their heads around them or talk about them, which adds to all the other stresses, right? So when people are walking on eggshells, the potential problem, right, is that they stop talking to each other in any kind of effective way. So the communication takes a hit, as John was talking about. When people aren't talking to each other so much, those feelings of trust and intimacy that bind you together as a family can start to get pretty wobbly. And when you're not trusting each other or feeling as comfortable together, it's a lot harder to do the planning and the problem solving that you need to do in order to meet all the challenges, right? And you end up with a lot of conflict and tension. So that rhythm that I talked about at the beginning gets disrupted because of this chain of events. Don't worry, I'm going to get to the positive part. Mm-hmm. So when you think about goals for your families, I think it's important to think about how you cope individually with these challenges, because there are a lot of them, and how you can cope as a family to make it work. You have to figure out how to manage those precious resources wisely. Remember, the money, the time, the energy, the emotions. You have to figure out how to stay healthy and well in spite of MS. And I'm not just talking to those of you who have MS, but all of you in the family who can sometimes get so focused on the MS or helping the person with MS to stay healthy and well that you forget about your own health and wellness. You can't be much of a care partner if your own health is suffering. So everybody in the family has to stay healthy and well. And you have to plan for the unpredictable. Kind of sounds like an oxymoron, but we'll talk about that more. Because planning for unpredictability is the best way that you have to create those safety nets for yourself that help you feel less stressed, more secure, whatever MS brings your way. And if you don't remember anything else from tonight, I want you to remember this quote from Dr. Peter Steinglass. He's a psychiatrist in New York who's done a lot of work in chronic illness, not MS in particular. But he talks about finding a place for the illness while keeping the illness in its place. What that means is that stranger's moving in the house, right? All that stuff, bag and baggage into the house, but you don't have to let it be strewn all over every room. You want to give MS the attention it needs, but no more than that. Doesn't have to become your career. Doesn't have to be the total focus of your family. If you can learn how to manage it. So here's a little exercise for you to think about, and you can do this periodically. All right? You have a piece of paper and you draw 2 circles on that piece of paper. And you label one of them My Pie. Just smashed the microphone. I wonder what that sounded like. And the other one is the Family Pie. And then you ask yourself, how big a piece of the pie is the MS? And there may be some days when it's the whole pie. It's just front and center. It's almost like somebody took that pie and smashed you in the face with it. But other days, you'll find that it's just a manageable piece of the pie. And then do the same thing for your family. You can do it together, you can do it individually, but it's a way to think about whether MS is taking up more of your important resources than you want it to. Okay? So we've talked about a lot of challenges tonight, and I think there are some key steps to coping with all of this. You're already taking the first step. When you come to meetings or you read or you go online, you're getting the information that you need to know what you're dealing with. Right? You're getting educated about MS and about resources that can help you. When you have that information, it allows you to communicate better about what's going on. And when you can communicate effectively, and we will talk more about how to do that, that's when you can do the kind of shared problem solving that you need to do to manage this. It takes active, planful problem solving. And we know from research that people who approach MS with a problem-focused attitude do better than people who sit back and kind of let it wash over them and say, well, whatever happens, happens. I can't do anything about it. So planful problem solving is an active coping strategy that we know works well for people. And you can learn how to do it. And when you can do that problem solving together, you can plan effectively for tomorrow, no matter what tomorrow may bring. Because of course we don't know. So information builds the foundation. And we're going to talk some now about why information is so helpful to adults, and then we'll talk later about why it's so helpful for children. But again, that information initiates the coping and allows people to communicate better. It encourages that joint problem solving. And it facilitates the planning. So it all starts with being here, getting information. So I think it's important, particularly in this world we have today, to pick where you get your information from. Because you are bombarded with information. And you're going to have to decide whether the information you're getting is information that you trust. So you're on the right track because you're going to a great doctor who will give you only the best possible information. You have several MS advocacy organizations that are dedicated to making sure you have access to accurate, current, unbiased information. Unbiased is important. You also now can get information from lots of pharmaceutical companies, and their websites have excellent information on them. They are good sources of information. You just need to remember that pharmaceutical companies are not only educating you, they're selling you a product. So when you read information that comes from the pharmaceutical company that manufactures and distributes the medication you take, you just need to have both your ears open so that you're distinguishing between information and advertisements. And if you're not sure, that's what you can ask your doctor about. Okay. They do have good websites. And Demos Health is a publishing company that probably has more MS literature than any publisher in the world, and it has good books about many, many aspects of life with MS. So I recommend it to you. Let me talk about communication, and then after we get through that piece, we'll get everybody up and stretching. Communication, we talk about it a lot. How important it is, how everybody should be doing it. And it was actually at a Can-Do program, formerly called the Hugeson, where we do these multi-day programs with people with MS and their support partners. And we talk a lot about communication there. And one day, one of the support partners, a husband, raised his hand and said, you know, you've been talking about communication for 3 days. Would you please tell us how to do it? And it was an eye-opener, actually. We'd sort of just been taking it for granted, and we hadn't really taken the time to do a workshop around communication. But people were really struggling because there were so many things that were getting in the way, even among couples who were used to communicating well with each other. MS was just throwing up a whole lot of obstacles. So we've talked about some of them already. People can just be so much in denial of what's going on that talking about it is sort of the last thing they want to do. Lack of information is really common, where people don't even begin to know how to talk about what's happening with their MS because they don't get it. They haven't read any of the basic information about the disease to even understand the symptoms or what's going on. They may have these conflicting coping styles. I'm sure many of you, if I said, how many of you have a non-talker in the family, would probably raise your hands. Most couples have a talker and a non-talker. What's what make the world go round, you know. Sometimes we're very protective of one another. You know, it's hard to talk about the things that scare us or make us angry or worried about us because you don't want to hurt the other person's feelings or stress them out any more than they're already stressed out or scare them any more than they're already scared. And so you just are so busy protecting each other that none of the stuff gets talked about. Sometimes it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing to talk about bladder or bowel problems or changes in sexual function or even cognitive changes. Some people just find it deeply embarrassing to talk about some of that stuff. So it gets brushed under the carpet. Carpet gets higher and higher with all the stuff pushed under it. In today's busy world, sometimes people don't even have a time or a place for that conversation. Busy with work, busy with kids, busy with whatever. You're so fatigued by the end of the day. Who has time to sit down and have a heart-to-heart about something that's stressful? Doesn't get talked about. Mood changes and cognitive changes also interfere with communication. They interfere so much that I want to talk about each of them a little bit. Depression is very, very common in MS. Okay? It differs from that normal grieving we talked about. There is nothing normal or healthy about depression. Okay? People with MS are at greater risk for depression than the general population. Way more than 50% of people with MS are going to experience a major depressive episode at some point in the course of their illness. And the reason that's true is because the depression is not just a reaction to the challenges we've been talking about. Depression in MS also results from changes in the brain and changes in the immune system. So MS has many, many symptoms. Depression can be one of them. You can have an episode of depression as a first symptom of MS. You can have an episode of depression long before you have major physical changes. Depression can have a life of its own in MS. Okay? Depression can affect cognition. All right, so we're going to talk about cognition in a minute, but it means that it can, if somebody's very, very depressed, it can also slow their thinking, make it harder for them to remember things. And spouses and partners are also at risk for different reasons. But it can mean that in your household, at any given time, one or both people can be dealing with significant depression. It is as deserving of treatment as any other symptom of MS, and the good news is it's one of the most treatable symptoms. So it's nothing about being weak or crazy or inadequate or a wimp or a wuss. Depression is a symptom that deserves to be accurately diagnosed and treated. It can be difficult to diagnose because several of the symptoms that characterize depression, like feeling slowed, sleeping too much, thinking more slowly, guess what? Are also symptoms of MS, right? So you may not know what's causing what. That's why it takes often a mental health specialist to help tease out what's your MS, what's depression. So if you're experiencing real changes in your mood that last for a few weeks at a time and don't lift, it's important to tell your healthcare team, your doctor, your nurse, so that you can get the care that you need to feel better. You know what the best treatment is? Medication if you need it. A little psychotherapy to talk about the issues. And exercise. We know that exercise improves mood. So if you, in addition to all the other things that exercise does for you, it will improve mood. So this is just a reminder of all the reasons why it's important to get the treatment for depression. Life with MS is hard enough without carrying an extra weight of the world on your shoulders. Right? So don't try to do it with depression on top of it. People who are depressed can't participate actively in their own care. They can't make all those decisions that we talked about, all those choices and decisions, because what happens when you're really depressed? You sort of don't care. It all feels too hard. So it's harder to follow the doctor's recommendations, to stick with your treatment, which can only work if you actually take it on a regular basis. People who are depressed can't plan or problem solve effectively, and they're really hard to live with. So, okay, so clearly if people are depressed, it's hard for them to communicate effectively with one another. So let's talk about cognition. This meeting last week, I heard a number up to 65% of people with MS may experience cognitive changes. That's a lot. Fortunately, most cognitive changes are manageable. They're mild to moderate changes, and people can learn how to compensate for them. But that's a big hit, 50 to 60+% of people experiencing some changes. We know that cognitive changes, along with fatigue, are a major reason why people leave the workforce early in MS. And we're all working harder to try and help people stay employed as long as they want to and are able. But cognition is a big part of the challenge. We also know that cognitive changes can happen at any time in MS. Again, cognitive changes can be a first symptom. The most cognitively impaired patient I ever worked with was a 14-year-old girl who had no physical symptoms of MS at the beginning. So they had no idea for a while that it was MS that she was dealing with. So you can't tell by looking at somebody if they're having cognitive changes or not. You can't as a loved one, physicians, nurses. You can't tell when somebody walks in the door if they have cognitive changes or not, because it's not related to the level of physical disability a person has. The most physically impaired person I ever worked with in my career had been told by the VA he was 350% disabled. He was pretty proud of that. He said, okay, couldn't move anything except his head and his mouth. And he was a full-time engineering professor at a university in New York. Totally physically disabled, was not cognitively impaired. So we cannot jump to conclusions. We cannot make assumptions about people with MS. We can't tell what's going on with cognition just by looking. Good news is that the cognitive changes generally progress pretty slowly, which means that it's worthwhile to get an accurate assessment of what's going on with your cognition and be taught some strategies to compensate for the problems, because if they progress slowly, you can be learning strategies and keeping up with whatever's happening cognitively, so you can sort of stay ahead of it by learning the strategies to compensate. These are the functions that tend to be affected in MS more commonly. Memory. For recent events, you're not going to forget your first kiss, the dress you wore to the prom, your first car, the science teacher you hated. You'll remember all of that, but you won't remember what your wife said to you that morning before you left for work, or what your kid said to you when she called on the phone to say she wasn't coming home after school because she was doing whatever. So it's the day-to-day stuff today that people have trouble remembering. People have trouble focusing their attention. They can get easily distracted, find it impossible to multitask. And in today's world, we're all supposed to be multitasking all the time. It becomes very, very difficult for people. The speed at which they process information is slowed. So you're having a conversation with somebody who has slowed information processing, and you see that they kind of glaze over. And you wonder, why? I just asked you a question. Why aren't you answering my question? Well, I was actually trying to answer the thing that you said 4 paragraphs ago, because I haven't caught up yet. So you can actually see it moving slowly, processing each thought. So they may report to the doctor or to somebody that they're having memory problems, and they may be, because memory problems are common, but it may also be that this processing is so slow that they didn't get that information to begin with, because they were still focused back a few minutes ago. And so didn't hear that last thing you said on the way out the door. Don't forget to pick up bread at the grocery store. Okay? So information processing can be slowed. Visual spatial organization means orientation in space, getting lost while driving. I wasn't born with with spatial sense, so I have nothing to lose. But some people report, coming to a four-way stop that they've been to 100 times, and they can't remember what they're supposed to do at the four-way stop. Or coming out of the office to go to the bathroom and not remembering whether it's right or left. It's also things like how objects fit together. Those toys that come, say, some assembly required, and you have to follow a diagram and be able to understand how to put things together. That's visual spatial organization that can be affected. Reasoning, planning, problem solving, what we call executive functions, all those things that all of us do every day, can be affected. Planning, prioritizing, problem solving. Judgment and decision making can sometimes be very difficult for people. And finding words, tip of the tongue. So these are all functions that can be affected. Typically people only experience one or two of those. Some people are more severely affected and can experience any of those. So remember, those mood changes and cognitive changes were just two on a long list of things that interfere with communication. So before we talk about how to improve communication, I just want you to think for a minute about all the different ways we communicate. We sort of think of it as just having conversations with one another, but we're actually communicating all the time. How we look at each other, the tone of voice we use, eye rolling, how we touch somebody, say we're helping somebody put their clothes on, or get on and off the toilet, or eat, how we grab that person's arm or move them. We express love, anger, frustration, tension. All those things can be expressed just in the way we touch that other person. Body language. Checking your emails while your wife is telling you something, watching television. Body language. Turning the other way. We also communicate by email, by text. So in today's world, it's gotten more complicated because we're really communicating multiple ways all the time. So we just need to be aware of that and sensitive to the fact that we're communicating even when we're not actually thinking that we are. So I just want to give you some tips for talking and some tips for listening. And I put them all on a slide so you can take them home and post them on your refrigerator. If you don't make time for talking, it won't happen. Our lives are too busy. So if it's important and there are things you need to be saying to each other, make sure there's time in the day or the week or the month that's set aside for quiet talking time. Make sure that you acknowledge the differences in your styles. Neither one of them is right or wrong. You just need to acknowledge those differences and be respectful of them. It's a good idea to start sentences with I. What happens when you start a sentence with you?
The other person gets defensive.
The other person gets defensive. There's no better way to back somebody into a corner than saying you. So start your sentences with I. I wish that. I feel that. I'm worried that. Makes it a lot easier for the other person to listen. Make sure you give the other person time to think about what you've said and respond, particularly if the person has some cognitive slowing. It may take them time and a repetition or two to really hear what you're saying. But even those of you who don't have MS and don't have any cognitive impairment may want some time to think about what you've heard and formulate a response. Some of us talk much more easily than others of us. So you need to allow time. Okay? And it's usually a good idea to think before you speak. Because all of us have times when we're frustrated or angry or frightened, where things come out of our mouths and then we say, where did that come from? Why did I say that? Because once it's out there, you can't really pack it up and put it back in. Try not to overgeneralize. Do you know what I mean? You never do anything I want you to do. You never do what I ask. You always have something to do when da 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 da. It doesn't give the other person very much wiggle room. Most of us are not ever or always something. We usually have a few good moments in there. So try not to overgeneralize. Try to talk about the specific issue rather than the entire person's lousy character. Okay? Dripping with sarcasm doesn't tend to facilitate communication. What are you laughing about? Sarcasm is, it's very humorous, and if if that's part of your style and the other person knows it, it's great. But I just think that sometimes sarcasm can be so painful and such a jab that it shows less respect. And try to remember that even somebody who loves you more than anything on earth can't read your mind. Right? We want to believe that people who love us know how we feel, know what we need, know what we want. But the fact is, we can't read each other's minds. So you need to think about what you want, what you need, what you feel, and tell the other person that. So prime example, somebody with MS who has good days and bad days. How many of you have good days and bad days? Okay, so on a good day, you want to be independent. You want to do things yourself. You don't want people to hover, be overprotective, treat you like a sick person, treat you like a child. You want to do it yourself. Okay? Everybody in the family gets the message. Don't mess with her. She wants to do it herself. That's Monday. Tuesday comes along. Tuesday's not such a good day. Why aren't you helping? Can't you see that I feel crummy today and I need your help? What's with everybody in this family? Can't have it both ways, right? You need to talk about what you need, how people can help on the bad days. And on the good days, you need to say, thank you. I really appreciate the offer, but I'm feeling really good today, so let me do it myself, and I'll let you know when I need some help. Okay, it's equally important to practice listening. Make sure that you listen and really listen and confirm what you've heard. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't assume you know. Listen. If you're not sure you get it, ask. Again, pay attention to your body language when you're listening. Your words may say one thing, but your rolling eyes, your smirk, your whatever may convey something else. So pay attention to what your body's doing while you're listening. And if something hurts, say ouch. And I mean this literally. It's a great shorthand signal. If somebody says something to you that's painful, disrespectful, hurts your feelings, a very nice shorthand is just to say, ouch. Everybody gets what ouch means. And it gives the other person a chance to think about what he or she has said. Oh, I didn't mean that to be hurtful. Let me clarify what I meant. Or, yeah, I guess that was a zinger. I'm sorry. Let me reframe that. Ouch is a really good way to let your partner know when that communication has gone awry. Try not to interrupt. That's going to be really hard for some of you if your partner with MS is having trouble getting your thoughts together, figuring out exactly what to say and how to say it. It can sometimes feel like it's taking a long time. Interrupting will not help. So try to respect your partner's need to communicate and get the thoughts out before you jump in and try to finish the sentences. Right? Don't jump to conclusions. If you're not sure what's going on, ask. And I'm sure there are others. But talking and listening are very, very active processes that take practice. So it doesn't matter where you practice. You can practice at home together, in self-help groups, online, at educational programs. But don't assume that it's an easy thing to do. If you're stuck, if communication has just kind of fallen away and you're having trouble reconnecting, a family counselor can really help jumpstart it. Can sort of help you start those conversations and find better ways to communicate with each other. Okay, so any questions about anything we've talked about so far? Comments about communication? Suggestions about things I should add to my slides?
Yes. Your key points in that here are in color, and so they're more difficult to read.
I missed the very last part of what you said.
Key points
Yeah.
are in color.
Are in color. On the s-
Italics,
yeah.
so they're more difficult to read.
Oh, so when they print out, they're harder to
They
read.
weren't big key points at the bottom.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's helpful. Yeah. Okay, I will remember that. Or I'll print them in color or something.
Not
Anything else? Okay, why don't we stretch, take a little break, and then we'll come back and do some more. So I want to talk about partnerships. And I want you to think broadly here. Yes, we're talking about spouses and life partners, but we're also talking about all of the other people that you have caring relationships with. Friends, children, neighbors, anybody in your sphere that you want to maintain a healthy relationship, a balanced relationship with, we're talking about here. Some of the pictures may all look like couples, but that's because those are the pictures you can find online. So think broadly about all the relationships in your life. And we're going to focus somewhat on these groups: spouses, partners, parents of adult children who have MS, children who have parents with MS, but again, other relationships as well. There are a lot of challenges associated with trying to keep that rhythm that we talked about. One of them is maintaining outside activities and social relationships, particularly if MS becomes more disabling or you feel more restricted in what you can do or where you can do it, it may result in you feeling more cut off from the people around you. So trying to keep your relationships busy and active can be challenging. Again, staying healthy and rested. Now, this is for both of you. It's not just about the person with MS. And how to manage those painful feelings that we talked about. So, to keep that rhythm going, we've talked about communication. That's a key piece, a first step to keeping relationships going. But it's also mutual respect, taking care of each other. It should never be a one-way street. Shared expectations, particularly if you're a couple. What are your expectations for your life, for the present, for the future? Sharing joys and sorrows. These are all part of that close relationship. Managing the changes and transitions that MS can bring to your lives, and even when MS isn't part of it, we always have to deal with changes and transitions as we age, as we go through other milestones in our lives. And figuring out how in your relationship to be both interdependent and independent. Both of those are critically important to maintaining a balanced, comfortable relationship. So it has to be a relationship that works for both of you, not just for one or the other of you. So in other words, it has to be balanced. And it takes effort and time and thought to keep that balance in which each of you is giving to the other and each of you is receiving. That's what makes our partnerships feel fulfilling, comfortable, healthy. So what I want to do now is talk about some tips for those of you who have MS, and then some tips for those of you who don't. Sometimes when you have MS, you can get so focused on the fact that it's yours, your illness, your disability, your challenge, that you can forget that both people in a partnership are living with it. Both people are affected by it. And just the way we now hear some people talk about, we are pregnant. We are pregnant. They didn't talk about that when I was having babies. We are pregnant. We have MS. You have it together. Your partner's health and wellness need equal time. They are just as important. So your partner needs to have time for rest, for exercise, for healthy nutrition, for stress management in whatever way he or she manages stress best. And they have their own mood issues, as we talked about. Both of you need time and space for recreation. Some of that you can do together. Some of that you may need to do separately because MS interferes with some of those shared recreational activities that you used to do. But if everybody gives up everything, what happens? Nobody's getting recreation, stress management, okay? Both of you need to maintain social connections. Again, even if you can't always do all of those things together the way you used to, it's important for each of you to have those important aspects of your life. It is critically important for you to plan, and it's much better to plan for the worst than it is to plan for the best. If you plan for the best, you haven't really planned for anything. Planning for the worst, even while you're hoping for the best, means you're prepared no matter what MS brings your way. So whether it's financially, logistically, in terms of the kind of car you buy or the kind of house you buy, your job situation, whatever it is, you are planning for the things that might happen so that you're prepared. You don't have to be worrying all the time that they might happen because you've done some good planning. So you know what you would do if you couldn't work in your current job, or you weren't able to walk, or you weren't able to, whatever it is you're most worried about. Planning for that helps you feel prepared. Remember, as we said, that even the most loving partner or friend in the world cannot read your mind. Using a mobility aid supports your partner as well as yourself. Do you know what I mean? When you use a mobility aid to go long distances and conserve energy and protect yourself and keep yourself safe, that means that your partner can enjoy your company. Doesn't have to worry that you're going to fall or get hurt. Doesn't have to slow down so much that walking with you is really tiring and challenging. So when you get a scooter and you scoot through the mall, or you scoot through the museum, or you scoot down the nature trail, that means your partner can enjoy being on an outing with you and get some good exercise, because you can go faster and then he or she'll have to keep up.
Big plus at Disneyland.
Big plus at Disneyland. You get to go to the head of the line. It's important to acknowledge that things take longer than they used to, and to plan for that. It's very hard for partners to feel like they're always late for things, unless they were the ones who were always late before. But, you know, it takes you longer. Plan for that. Start sooner. That's your responsibility. And here's the most important one of all. Appreciate your partner's efforts, even if they're not perfect. If your partner does something for you around the house, or does something that you needed done, even if he or she doesn't do it exactly the way you would have done it, or doesn't do it quite as well as you would have done it, appreciate the effort. Okay? For those of you who don't have MS, you get some tips too. When you get on an airplane, what does the flight attendant say? The shortage of oxygen in the cabin. Nope. Other way around. You put on your own oxygen mask first, and then you take care of the person who needs help. If you don't take care of yourself, pay attention to your own health, your own wellness, you can't be much of a partner for somebody else. That's not being selfish. That is taking care of yourself. Yes?
Clarification, two people, one has MS, okay? Oxygen mask comes down, they should both get their own mask, basically? As long as they can. Otherwise, you put yours on.
Everybody gets one.
Everybody gets one. In life, we need to put on our own first, if we can, and then help the other person, okay? Acknowledge your own losses as well as your partner's. Again, this is a disease that you both live with. It has caused you losses and changes as well, and you need to acknowledge them and grieve over them, just like your partner does. Your partner may have lost some function, may have lost some independence, sense of self, identity, self-esteem. So you have to acknowledge his or her losses, but you also need to acknowledge your own. Perhaps you're not feeling as independent anymore. You don't have as much free time. You don't have as much opportunity to do all the things you want to do. Those are losses. And it's okay to acknowledge those and grieve over them. You need to plan for things taking longer than they used to. They're gonna. So it's not worth your time to be angry about it every single time, day after day. Acknowledge that things take longer. Provide assistance when you can. And plan for things to take longer. And it's okay for you to ask your partner to use a mobility aid, because it helps you too. Don't make assumptions about what your partner with MS needs or doesn't need. Ask. You're not going to be able to tell by looking. So much of MS is invisible. So don't jump to conclusions or assume you know. If you have activities that mean a lot to you, hobbies, recreational activities, things, don't give them all up just because your partner can't do some of them. You may have to give up some, but you need to hold on to some of those things that are important to you. Otherwise, people end up feeling guilty, resentful, angry, deprived, and that's not good for anybody. So pick and choose, but if there are some things that are truly important to you, talk about that and say, we need to figure out a way that I can get out and do this every once in a while because it's really important to me. And maybe we can be thinking about something that you can be doing at the same time that's special for you. Okay? Watch out for signs of being maxed out. People who provide care, particularly when they're providing a lot of hands-on care for someone they love, can get maxed out. Again, this is not about being weak or selfish or inadequate. You can be a loving, wonderful partner and reach a level of frustration and fatigue that is beyond what you can tolerate. So here's a hint. If you find yourself saying or doing anything that you wouldn't want the neighbors to see, that's a signal that you're maxed out. Talking in a way that you wouldn't want people to hear, grabbing somebody, feeling angry and out of control, that's a sign that you need some help. And you can call the National MS Society anytime and say, you know what, I'm kind of at my limit here and I need some help. Or call your doctor's office and talk to your doctor or the nurse and say, I need help. If you're engaging in unhealthy behaviors, too much alcohol, too many drugs, too much risk-taking behavior, that also can be a signal that you're maxed out. Pay attention to your own mood, because remember, you're susceptible to depression as well and anxiety. And it's okay to tell somebody that you need some help with that. And you also need to plan for the unpredictable future. I've worked with a lot of care partners, spouses, partners, family members, spend an inordinate amount of time being anxious about the future. What if this happens? What if this happens? How am I going to be able to keep this family afloat? What happens if we lose 2 incomes? What if, what if, what if? That's when you need to sit down and figure out, what would I do if this happened? Because that's the only way to relieve yourself of all of that anxiety. And again, the National MS Society has a lot of resources to help you with financial planning, life planning, planning for the unpredictable future. Good, free consultation services that are available for everybody. You are not alone. There are a zillion resources out there to help you that most people have no idea even exist. But if you call the National MS Society and say, this is the situation I'm in and is there anything to help, they will help you connect with resources in your community to deal with those challenges. Okay? 1-800-FIGHT-MS. That's all you need to remember. Okay? Any questions about that before we talk about kids? Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about this plan for the worst but hope for the best?
Sure. When people come, well, starting when people are diagnosed with MS, they will come in and they'll say, what if I end up in a wheelchair? Or what if this vision in my eye doesn't come back? Or what if I can't work? I mean, everybody's worries are different, but everybody has things that scare them to death, right? So my answer is, okay, what if? Let's talk about it. What would you do if that you're most worried about were to happen? What could you do today that would help you feel more prepared if that thing that you're most frightened about were to happen? So for example, if it's being worried about losing one's job or one's ability to do one's job, then we talk about, okay, what are your skills? What are the skills that you bring to the job you have? Are any of those skills applicable to a different kind of job? Or is this a good time to talk to a vocational rehabilitation counselor to figure out what other kinds of job opportunities there might be for you, or what kind of training you could take today that would help prepare you for a time when you can't do the job that you have now? So it's just planning and preparing so that you don't feel so vulnerable all the time. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Well, what we did was 10, 12 years ago, we went from a two-story house to a single-story house.
Exactly.
Because we knew that stairs and access was going to be an issue later on in life.
Right. That's a perfect example. Yeah.
And I was going to say just what he said. I went from a two-story to a one-story. I could walk at that time, no problem. And then, fast forward to today, I'm on a cane, and I cannot go up the stairs. So you do have to plan. I didn't know if that was going to happen, but I knew that if it does happen,
you'll be ready. So that's a great example of the way that you can think about and set yourself up so that you're more prepared, and then you don't have to worry about it. There's enough things to worry about in life, and those thoughts that keep going around and round and round in your head, and you don't get anywhere with those worries. They just sort of float around in there. Those are the best ones to sit down and say, okay, I want to stop worrying about this. What am I going to do to prepare myself? Does that help? Any other examples where people have taken steps today to try and, yeah?
I got a similar thing. I had a two-story place, and I got one of those stair climber things in it. And that way, I have the option of using the stairs when I feel like it, and I do that as often as I can. And I use it when evening when I'm tired, I just get on it.
Yeah.
I put ramps on the front and back of the house so she can go up and down. And then it came about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I had to remodel the house and put a whole new bathroom on it so she could have a bathroom that she could get in and out of. To get to the point where she could walk the hallway into the bathroom.
Mm-hmm. We all need somebody like you around the house, clearly.
Well, I had it done. I'm 75 years old. I didn't.
Yeah.
Actually look into and plan for the possibility of disability. Because we're not off work and actually not working anymore. So, that's kind of a fearful thing, and I guess we could look into that.
Well, I think it's important to look into how disability works and what the rules are related to it and what kind of income that you can count on and what ways you can add to that income without jeopardizing the insurance. Yeah.
Just to add on to that, you can start to plan for only a single income. So if you're used to two, what would it take to adjust, and can you make changes in your life now or over the next couple of years that will allow you to live off of only one?
Perfect. You've got it. So take the things you're most worried about and problem solve them today. Okay? All right, so I want to spend some time talking about children, and remember this is children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews. It's not just your own kids. But, you know, I get asked all the time, so how much should I tell the kids about MS? And I had one woman came up to me at a meeting like this, and she said, I really want my son to understand about my MS. I just, you know, I want to be open about this. I want him to get it, and I just, you know, I want to know all the resources. And I said, well, how old is your son? And she said, 7 months. So I said, well, we've got a little time. We don't have to start until he can actually talk. But at the other end, you know, I've had parents come up to me and say, you know, I haven't talked about this with my kids at all. I mean, I don't want to burden them. I don't want them to be worried. This isn't their problem. I really just, you know, don't want to talk to them. I said, well, how old are your kids? Well, they were 19 and 21. You know, they're old enough to go off and fight for their country, but they're not old enough to deal with mom's MS. So it's obviously somewhere in between those two, and if you can't tell already, I'm an advocate for being open with kids about what's going on, and there's some important reasons for that. Kids know. Even when we don't talk about what's going on, they are very quick to pick up worries. They know when their parents' moods are off. They know when there's that tension in the household and walking on eggshells. They know when mom or dad doesn't feel well. And when we don't tell them, their imaginations just fill in the blanks. And kids' imaginations are pretty vivid, right? So better we should fill it in with the truth than the even scarier things that their imaginations come up with. So overall, here's what we know about kids. There's a lot of research that indicates that in general, kids do just fine. They adapt well, they do well in school, they have friends. That doesn't mean there aren't rough spots across the way, and it doesn't mean there aren't challenges, but we know that in general, kids who have a parent with MS do well. We also know that they want to know what's going on. They don't want to be the last to hear anything. They don't want to hear it by accident from some well-meaning friend or relative. They want to know what's going on. Parents do tend to underestimate their children's worries and fears about this. You know, and I think it's in part because parents are so worried that their MS is going to be a bad thing for their kids that they then tend to underestimate what's actually going on in those little minds. So it's important to acknowledge that kids have questions and have worries, and to deal with them so that they can get on with their lives and not have to worry so much. We know that children find the emotional and cognitive symptoms more difficult to deal with than the physical ones. A problem with walking, a kid can kind of get. They can see it. They can see a cane, they can see a walker, they understand that a person can't walk. But the cognitive changes or the depression are much harder for them to get their little heads around. And they can easily misinterpret those cognitive changes or the depression. So it's important to explain to them what's going on. We also know that many parents avoid programs for kids because they're worried that the programs will upset them. But what happens is that they avoid the educational programs or they avoid the recreational programs for their kids until there's suddenly a crisis. And then it's much harder to help and to educate and to calm down. So we also advocate taking advantage of the programs that the National MS Society and other advocacy groups offer for young kids, because it's a way for them to learn about MS Meet other kids who have a parent with MS. Ask questions and do it all in a sort of fun environment. Children of all ages share some primary concerns. They will express them differently depending on what age they are. But these are the questions. They want to know if mom or dad is going to die. They want to know if they're going to catch it. And they want to know if they caused it. And you can hear some variation of these questions whether the kids are 30 or 5. And the trick for parents is that you need to answer these questions at an age-appropriate level, right? You need to gear your answer to where your child is at. But basically, they need answers to those questions. Do you know what the answers are? What? We all die. Well, yes, we do all die. Hopefully not tonight. No, I think that's correct. We all die, and there is no reason, right, for a child to have to worry about that. They need to know that mom or dad was going to be there and take care of them. As children get older, we can talk about the ways in which MS or any other serious illness can, for some people, affect the lifespan. But in MS, most people live very close to a normal lifespan, and children can be reassured that mom or dad will be there to take care of them. No, MS is not a contagious disease like the chicken pox or the flu or a cold, like the things that kids know about. And so for the young child, it's very simple to say, no, it's not contagious, you can't catch it. When kids get into high school and they're learning about genetics in class, you can talk about the component related to genetics in a person's susceptibility to developing MS. You don't talk about that to a 5-year-old, but you talk about it as a child gets old enough to understand how genes work. Did I cause this to happen? No. That's a clear no. But what happens in families is kind of interesting. We know that during pregnancy, a woman's risk of having a relapse goes way down, right? The hormones of pregnancy protect her and the unborn baby, and in doing that, they actually lessen MS disease activity. So women feel great when they're pregnant. Some of them say they wish they could just stay pregnant. But right after delivery, a woman's risk of having a relapse goes up. And what that means is that there are a lot of women who have their first symptoms of MS right after delivering a baby. So the family lore goes, I got MS right after Jimmy was born. How many times does Jimmy have to hear that before, my mom got MS because of me? So we have to be careful how we talk about that, right? Or if you say to your kids, you're making my MS worse. You're just getting me so upset and I'm so stressed out and I'm going to get sick and end up in the hospital again if you don't behave. Not a great message, right? Because children's behavior isn't what makes MS progress. And it isn't what makes relapses happen. But, if we fall into that kind of miseducation about things, it's not long before kids worry that they've made their mom or dad worse. So we have to be careful how we talk about it. Again, kids respond to that emotional climate in the household and may have a lot of questions about what's going on, even if they're not asking. We as adults need to take responsibility to make sure that information is out there, available, that we're talking so that we're responding to some of those unspoken worries or concerns that they may have. So this is a kind of a typical old-fashioned drawing of the central nervous system that makes your eyes glaze over, and that's not really a very good explanation about MS. But this is a child's drawing that I truly love, called The Very Nervous System. And when we did a study a lot of years ago, we went around to families and we interviewed young children and parents about MS. And we asked these little kids how they knew a person had MS. And it was amazing how often the answer was, "It makes mom really cranky." Now, we know actually that depression in MS is often expressed as irritability. Did you know that? So that sometimes you don't see the more common, tearful, hopeless, sad. Sometimes the primary symptom is a lot of irritability. Like somebody's covered with black and blue marks, so wherever you touch them, they're pretty reactive, ornery, cranky. And we also know that even when people aren't depressed, that there's a lot of irritability and moodiness that can be part of MS, right? That caused by those changes in the brain. So kids pick up on that, just like spouses do. So we need to be able to talk about it and explain to kids what's going on, because they will be very quick to assume it's all them. And so you need to relieve that burden a little bit and make sure they understand that they are not the cause of the irritability. So information helps kids in a lot of different ways, right? First of all, if you talk to your kids about MS, it makes sure that you're the one who's giving them the information. If you have talked to them, that reduces the risk that they'll hear about it from a teacher, a grandparent, a neighbor who just spills the beans by accident. You really want this important information to come from you. It's very reassuring when your kids hear important information from you, because it gives them the signal that you're in charge, that you can handle it, that it's not too scary to talk about. So you're doing them a favor when you talk to them about what's going on. It also validates what they've already somehow sensed and picked up, that there's something wrong, and now you're letting them know exactly what it is. When you talk about it, obviously in age-appropriate language, you're creating a boundary around their fears. Their imaginations don't have to take off and assume all these horrible, dire things. You've put a boundary around that and told them exactly what the issue is. If you haven't seen it, Keep Smilin' is a publication that the National MS Society has done. It's a quarterly newsletter for children between the ages of 7 and 12. You can either request it and it'll get mailed to them, and it's the cutest thing you have ever seen. The graphic designers won a lot of awards for it. It's just fabulous. Or you can go online and it's an interactive thing filled with games and coloring. When we get stressed out at work, we turn it on and we... What? Yes, it's an interactive application, thank you. But it's wonderful for kids, the younger kids, and it has a parent pull-out section in the middle, which actually gives you tips on how to use some of the information in there to talk about MS with your kids. So it's super. If you haven't seen it, check it out. When you give kids information, it does reassure them and give them a sense of control, because they know what's going on. It gives them a vocabulary to ask questions, because they may have all kinds of questions but not even know how to begin to ask them. But because you've brought it up, described it, filled in some of the blanks for them, now they know how to ask the question. Yeah?
Do they have anything for older children, like young teens?
There are a couple of brochures that are good for older kids. It is really hard to write for teenagers, really hard. I've tried. But there are a couple of booklets that are designed to help young teens and older teens. Also, they have some good online community things where kids can actually get together and talk and learn from each other, which is often the best way for teens to learn. But yes, if you go into the library on the website, there are booklets that, and they say for what age group they're for. Oh, good. And one of the most important things about communicating with kids about MS is that you're modeling how families work together to solve a problem, to manage a problem. So it builds trust within the family, and it increases the likelihood that when your kids run into their own challenges in life, which we know they do, that they'll be more comfortable coming back because they know that their family is a place where people share issues and problem solve together. So, before I stop, I just want to remind you again about the National MS Society's MS Navigator program. If you call this general number, you are connected with what we call an MS Navigator. They are all trained social workers. They have scads of information about MS, but they also know about all your local resources. So you can contact them or by phone or by email and ask your question. And all of these services are available to you. You don't have to do this alone. So don't hesitate to call and get help with any of these things that you might need. Okay? And here are some readings, particularly related to the stuff I've talked about tonight. The first book, It's Not All in Your Head, Anxiety, Depression, Mood Swings, and MS, is one of the best overall descriptions I've seen of some of the mood issues that we were talking about tonight. Okay, so we have some time for questions, comments, suggestions. Or have I worn you out? Yes, ma'am.
One of your resources up there was your MS for Dummies, and it said due in 2/12.
Yes, the second edition is coming out in April.
Okay, is the other one out of print?
No, it's still there. The changes in this new edition, obviously there's a treatments chapter, and we've got a lot of new approved medications since the last edition came out, so there are changes in that. The insurance chapter talks about the healthcare reform and how that may or may not affect issues related to chronic illness. And then all of the chapters have been updated somewhat. But the biggest changes are around treatment.
You said it's going to be available in electronic form too?
Yes, you're going to be able to download it to your iPad or your whatever, and it's going to be more interactive so that.
So all those are available through Amazon.com?
Yes, everything's available through Amazon. Yes, sir.
Are those books you was referring to in audio also? Do you know?
That's a good question. There's one book up there that I edited called Multiple Sclerosis, The Questions You Have, the Answers You Need. And that's in its 5th edition, and what that publisher is doing is you can now get it in all kinds of formats. You can order it in whatever font or style, audio, not audio. So if you're particularly looking for an audio format, that would be the book that I would look for.
What was the name of it again?
Multiple Sclerosis, The Questions You Have, the Answers You Need.
Okay.
Is that on the?
Yes.
Is the
Okay,
handout
so
there?
It's on that list. That's the only one I know of that's on audio. Yes.
So basically, now going back to what we were talking about, the best way to get through most of it is to find that way to talk with your partner and your family, and then you have to do it again in 6 months or a year or 4 years. So
You
it's
have to do
constant.
it a lot. You know, it's true of most things in life, but I think whether it's talking to your kids or talking to your spouse or other family members, you know, you have to keep the communication lines going. With kids, you have to do it because their level of understanding changes, and the words you're going to use are going to, it's like sex education. You can't sit all 5 kids down at once, tell them about the facts of life, and be done with it. It just doesn't work that way. So each of your kids learns differently, for example, so you have different kinds of conversations or use different kinds of learning tools depending on how your child learns. But the same thing is true with family members and friends. They're all different, and as your situation changes, it's really going to fall on you to keep the lines of communication open, because they're not going to do it for you. It means you have your teaching hat on all the time. It means that you're sharing reading materials or being willing to answer questions, and just remembering that they can't read your mind. And if people seem to be backing away or pulling away from you in some way, chances are they just need you to reach out and do some communicating, because they're not sure what to ask or what to say. Okay? Thank you. You've been remarkably awake and attentive.